Hi, I'm Michael Wyetzner. I've been an architect for 33 years. And today we're going to look at the evolution of luxury living in New York City through movies and TV shows. Longfellow Deeds' apartment in Mr. Deeds.
So this is where my uncle lives?
Yes, sir, for the last 35 years of his astonishing life.
So here's everything that jumps out at me. This grand stone staircase with this beautiful wrought iron railing, these huge columns framing the entrance, these sort of exotic lion-like sculptures, this huge Persian rug, and these palm fronds, which are very indicative of the way rich people lived in the 1920s when it appears this apartment would have been from. Although this is a set and it appears somewhat fantastical, in reality, people lived in apartments like this with these huge ceiling heights combining multiple floors, and that called for a grand staircase like the one you see in front of you.
Was that awesome?
So in reality, like at 740 Park Avenue, a very famous building for the wealthy, there are like 3-story apartments up there that have 37 to 40 rooms in them. So they really are mansions in the sky. In fact, it became quite common for developers to sort of take a tract of land that was inhabited by a mansion, and part of the deal to sell would be that they would recreate that mansion up at the top of the apartment building for the original owner. So in this image, we're looking down from the great balcony, and you could really see how vast the apartment is.
Wow. That's an echo, sir.
You could see this beautiful marble floor, and at the time these were built, labor was so cheap, so you could have the finest craftsmen from around the world come and create these palatial apartments. And in the distance, you could see this grand elevator, which is somewhat fictitious because in actuality, when these apartments were built in the 1920s, elevators were much, much smaller, usually just for 3 or 4 passengers. In fact, it's so big you can see that there's a couch in it. But that's not unusual. Many of the elevators that were originally built, even though they were small, they usually contained a chair for the resident to sit in on their way up to their grand apartment. So when you actually look in the elevator, besides that extremely overstuffed sofa with the lions on the edges, you could see these sort of pilasters, which are like columns built into the wall. So quite often pilasters were structural. There was just a part of the wall that needed to carry a larger load. Usually a beam sat on top of it, but it's built into the wall. In this case, they're purely decorative because we're inside an elevator car. It's not holding up anything. Nate's Upper East Side townhouse on Gossip Girl. Okay, so here's everything that jumps out at me. To me, this looks like it was built at the turn of the century. It's a London townhouse, elevated just a little off the street. It's got this articulated stone base. It has this somewhat grand entrance, but still at a small scale. It has these limestone coins at the corners and this brick infill between it, and it has this curved bay window above the entrance. So a London townhouse is different from a traditional New York City brownstone in that it's only elevated a little bit above the street, where a brownstone in New York typically is elevated a complete story above the street, what's called the piano nobile, or the parlor floor in English, and that's the main floor of the house. Underneath is sort of a lower level that's reserved for servants and service people entering the building. And that was done basically to avoid the mess that were in New York City streets in the 1800s from all the horses. But the London townhouses were typically built in much tonier neighborhoods, and there was less mess in those neighborhoods, so they could afford to be closer to the street. The windows in the bay window are composed of small lights, as they call them. It's very small panes of glass. Today, all glass is insulated, which means there's 2 panes with an air gap between. But in the early days, that technology didn't exist, certainly in 1910 when this house was built. So everything was made out of single pane glass, and usually very thin, 1/8 of an inch. The little frames between pieces of glass are called mullions, and you could see them over here on the sides of the windows and over here. The mullions were made out of lead, and that is why it's called leaded glass, and that goes all the way back to the stained glass you see in churches. And lead is a really soft metal, and it's very pliable, and that's how you can get all these really nice shapes and create these sort of scenes. So let's move to the interior.
Where do you think you're going?
Anywhere but here.
What this illustrates, I think, really well is that these sorts of townhouses only had light available to come in at the front and the back. So the middle part of the building was traditionally kind of dark, and the living spaces would always be where the light was. So because the light is only available at the front and the back, it forms like a dumbbell in plan, where the larger rooms are at the ends and the middle is sort of constricted with all these sort of service spaces. So light is only available to come in the front and the back, but because there's always a house next door, light can't get in. So typically the second floor would be the main floor where most of the living was done, or most of the spaces were the living room, the dining room. And the ground floor would be for the more mundane and service tasks. The kitchen would be down there, some storage would be down there, but it would be more like a transition space. And then people would take a grand staircase up to the second floor where there was much more light available and it was a much brighter space. So this house is a perfect representation of old money in New York, and it works perfectly for the Archibald family in Gossip Girl. Bobby Axelrod's penthouse in Billions.
Is that always the way you do business?
Yeah, you?
Of course.
This appears to be a real penthouse. Right away you could see the double-height glass, the exposed concrete columns with their really crisp corners, and you see the step up to the roof beyond, and you could see that it's a real penthouse, that it's surrounded by a roof with all these really beautiful plantings surrounding it. So typically, penthouses were built for the servants. They were the servants' quarters up there. It was a small shanty built on the roof. It was really hot in the summer, and it was really cold in the winter. But people started to realize, wait a minute, these spaces could be kind of desirable. Servants quite often outfitted these beautiful gardens with potted plants all around there, and the views were really great from up there. So people realized, and developers especially, wait a minute, we could market these as really exclusive apartments. Not only that, but typically there was only one per building, and they became the ultimate in New York in urban living. So this outdoor space is really a luxury, especially in New York, and it's a real sign of wealth, especially one that's this large. It's extremely desirable and it's a luxury, but it really grew out of necessity, and it grew out of zoning laws that required these sort of setbacks that created these outdoor spaces.
I usually see jealousy turn into the other thing. Greed.
So prior to 1916, there was one particular building that went up down on Wall Street, Manhattan, called the Equitable Building, and it went straight up for 30 stories or so, and it caused a great outcry in the city because people were concerned that the sunlight would be blocked. So in 1916, the city enacted a new set of zoning laws wherein buildings had to set back after a certain height. So before the 1916 zoning laws, if this is the street and there's a person standing on the street, you were able to build a building, you just go straight up and there's your building. And obviously that cast a huge shadow. So what the 1916 zoning laws attempted to do was you'd go up for a certain height and then you'd have to set back, and then you could go up again until you hit what's called the sky exposure plane, which is dictated in the zoning. And once you hit that plane, you'd have to go back again, and then you could go up again, and then you'd have to go back again. And this is where the penthouse would sit, right? But then each one of these becomes an outdoor terrace, and these floors become extremely desirable. So after those zoning ordinances went into effect, those setbacks helped define the New York City skyline to this day. So these sort of wedding cake style buildings that set back are ubiquitous across the New York City skyline, and you could see it in the Empire State Building and in the Chrysler Building. Unlike in a city like Chicago that has very different setback laws, where you can build straight up, you get a very different skyline. The Valmont House in Cruel Intentions.
Sir, there's no parking, sir. You can't park, sir. You can't park.
So this is a perfect example of the kinds of mansions that were built along Fifth Avenue in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was called Millionaire's Row along Fifth Avenue, and today many of them have been converted to museums and consulates and institutes. Carnegie built his mansion there, Otto Kahn built his mansion there, the Warburgs built their mansion there, and it just marches all the way up the street. So let's take a look at a clearer image of this. What jumps out at me is there's this tympanum entrance with grand wooden doors. There's the remnants of what would have been a rose window in a church above the doors. There's this beautifully articulated Gothic-style bay window. There's these small font-like windows, which are probably used for a bathroom, and there's a blind window next to it for symmetry's sake. There are these beautifully articulated dormers in the roof with these finials on the top. There's this large architectural element of the clustered chimneys together, and there's a really, really steep roof line, which made it easier to inhabit the attic floors, which are traditionally where the servants lived. So this is very reminiscent of like a French chateau or French Renaissance architecture, but there's also elements of Gothic architecture, which the French did exceedingly well in all their beautiful churches. Typically on those old Gothic churches, there would be what's called a tympanum entrance. It's this layered sort of folding back, almost like an ear, which is how it gets its name. And I find it really interesting that to keep the symmetry line, which the architect created here, this local symmetry, that this small window, which was probably used for a bathroom, is then mirrored on the other side as a blind window, which means it's not a window at all. They just filled it in with stone. There's elements of a mansard roof. You could see this flat portion over here and the really steep incline of the gable, which allowed people to inhabit the space underneath that roof or the attic a lot more easily than they could if the pitch was much lower. The house just to the left in this photo is an even clearer example of that kind of roof. And the mansard roof was developed by the architect named Mansart in Paris in the 1600s to skirt zoning laws at the time. So in Paris in the 1600s, I believe you were only able to build 5 stories tall and then have an attic on top. And it's difficult to inhabit. There's these sort of edges and you lose a lot of the space. But Mansart figured out a way that if you made the pitch of the roof much steeper, that you could actually get an extra floor out of it and you could inhabit that floor. I think this is a really cool house. It's a little spooky because of all that sort of Gothic ornamentation, and I think that fits in really well with the people who lived here in the movie. It gives you the indication that maybe some nefarious activities are going on within. The Dakota Building in Rosemary's Baby. So this is the Dakota Building, a very famous building in New York City, which has a lot of history and actually represents a distinct shift in the way that rich people and extremely wealthy people started to live in New York. So the first thing that jumps out at me is this bay window along the exterior that's topped by this dome. It has this very steep roof with all of these dormers, most likely used for servants' quarters. It has this dry moat, as we call it, which is an areaway that surrounds the edge of the building along the sidewalk. It's made of a light tan brick, and it has this grand entrance into a courtyard. So previously people lived in these sort of grand townhouses and mansions, and this was an effort by a developer named Clark to lure people away from that kind of living and come into this apartment style living, which at that time in the 1880s was not very popular in New York.
Oh, it's a wonderful apartment. I love it.
See what she's trying to do? She's trying to get you lower the rent.
So the other thing that jumps out at me is the lack of fire escapes. Apartment houses at the time in the 1880s were mainly tenements. Those always had fire escapes on them, and the architect wanted this to look distinctly different from that. And he was one of the first to make everything out of fireproof material, so all the walls are brick and the floors are made of concrete and filled with mud that was harvested from Central Park. It was fireproof and it also acted as sound dampening. So it was called the Dakota because it was actually being made fun of because it was so far uptown and so far west that people said it might as well be in the Dakota Territory, which wasn't even a state yet. But Edward Clark, to his credit, embraced that and used that as the name of the building. Before this, the east side was where all the rich people lived. Nobody of any means would live on the west side. It just wasn't chic or fashionable. So not only were they trying to lure people to a different way of living, they were trying to lure people to a different area of living as well.
It's better located.
Yeah, well, God knows I could walk to all the theaters from here.
Oh, Guy, let's take it, please.
So one of the ways the developer was trying to lure extremely wealthy people out of their townhouses and mansions and into an apartment was to offer a number of amenities, very much like a hotel would. One of them was this grand dining room on the ground floor. They had a kitchen dedicated solely to making pastries. There were 150 servants to cater to the needs of all the residents. So it was a different style of living that the developer was trying to create. And the building was the first to introduce service elevators in New York City that the staff could take so that they wouldn't have to ride in the same elevators as the wealthy people who lived there. Each passenger elevator served only 2 apartments. Those elevators were powered by hydraulics, which is water in a piston under great pressure. The building actually supplied its own water. It harvested the rainwater to use in these hydraulics. At the same time, the building also produced its own electricity with a steam plant. The steam plant was underneath the lot next door where there were tennis courts and there was a rose garden which bloomed all year because of the warmth from the steam. So the other amenity that this building offered were views of Central Park. But at that time, the servants actually got the best views because they were always at the top of the building. In 1884, when the building was built, elevators were still kind of a new thing and people were wary of them. So to bring people up to, the 7th floor was a big ask. So all these elevators were highly ornamented, built out of this beautiful woodwork. They always had someone who operated it with that hand crank, and there was these multiple gates. But it was done in a way that made it very ritualistic, and they were much smaller than you would see today. This is a shot of the entrance from 72nd Street, which is the main entrance into the courtyard. It has a sad history. John Lennon was shot right in this entrance where they're standing. And what jumps out at me in this image is this really sort of grand portico that leads you into the courtyard Within, you could see the Roman brick here, which is different from traditional brick, and that Roman brick is flatter and longer. Frank Lloyd Wright was a big fan of the Roman brick because his prairie-style architecture, he always wanted it to be as horizontal as possible, reaching out into the landscape, and the Roman brick reinforced that. The building also had a history of sort of haunted lore. People said they saw ghosts and specters in this building for years. So there's a long and sort of spooky history to the Dakota, which is one of the reasons why it was selected by the director for Rosemary's Baby.
This is no dream. This is really happening.
Josh Baskin's loft in Big.
It's quite a unique space. A modern kitchen, a brand new bathroom with a jet stream jacuzzi. We'll take it.
Okay, so what immediately jumps out at me are the large windows that surround the apartment, giving it a ton of natural light. The plain wood floors, just strip flooring. The just simple plywood cabinetry underneath the windows that helps to conceal the radiators and create some storage space. You could see this industrial clear plastic curtain over there that you'd find on a loading dock. So originally, these lofts, which were typically in Soho in these beautiful cast iron buildings, were used for manufacturing. But as the manufacturers left New York, these floors were left vacant, and artists realized that these were perfect spaces for making art with all the natural light and the wide open space. And so quite often they moved in illegally and made these spaces habitable, putting in their own plumbing where it didn't exist. But they were living in areas that were zoned for manufacturing, and that's not permitted, so laws were passed called the loft laws that allowed artists to live in these spaces and allowed landlords to fix them up for the artists. So eventually all these spaces were rezoned for residential, and the artists were priced out and had to move on and find other neighborhoods to make their art in. So for the very reason that artists found these spaces desirable, because they were filled with light and they were wide open, sort of blank canvases, Josh Baskin, this little kid living in an adult body, found the loft was perfect for exactly his use, which was just basically to fill it with all of his toys.
You live here?
Yeah. Nice, isn't it?
So now the apartments, they become redone and finished and polished, and they become something totally antithetical than what they were originally intended to be by the artists. And they go for a ton of money. The way luxury has been defined in New York City has changed drastically over time. And I think that's really reflected in the spaces that we looked at today and the characters that inhabit them.